I'm Bonnie Rumilly, and on the morning of 9/11, I was 19 years old, sitting at my house, and I remember watching one of the planes hit the towers. And I was to go down to college that morning. I was commuting at the time to college, and so I watched everything happen on the news, and then I drove to school. And I remember I was sitting in science class, and one of the kids, I don't know how he found out, but he had gone to the bathroom and left the classroom and came back. And I remember when he walked back in, he said what had happened again, but then he had reported there was a second hit to the second tower, collapsing by this point. And at that point, there was no sitting in class for me. The teacher had decided to stay on with teaching and kept the class going, but I had decided to leave. And at the time, I had been an EMT since high school. I started EMT class when I was 17 years
Wow.
old. And so I knew at that moment how bad it was and that I was going to need to head to EMS and see what was happening.
And where did you go to school?
So I, at the time, was living in Fairfield County, and I went to school in Stamford.
Oh, wow. So that close, and they still kind of went on with the day.
Yes.
Whoa.
Yes. And maybe it was that particular teacher, but I don't think that everyone knew the gravity of it yet. And because it was before cell phones, no one was sitting on their cell phone in class checking the news or the headlines. So I think that particular teacher just said, let me finish what I'm doing and see what's happening
Right.
later. But just having the EMS training, I felt compelled to get up and go.
And so you went down there for how long?
Yeah, so I went to my local EMS agency where we would all gather in such a time. And I remember we were all huddled watching the TV and just watching everything unfold, feeling very hopeless, sitting there together, watching our fellow first responders on TV with what was happening. And of course, in this area, a lot of people worked in the city. So everyone was trying to figure out who they knew and who had made it back. And there was a particular moment where a fax came in, and the fax basically said, any available EMS units, please respond. Fire, EMS, police. But ours was EMS. And so when we got that fax, we knew we had to send people. So there were 15 of us that went down, and I was one of the 15. I remember people flipping coins as to who was going to stay and cover the town and who was going to go. We didn't know how long we would be gone. At the time, I remember going home. I was raised by my grandparents, and so my grandfather was living at that time. He had been a World War II veteran. And I remember going home and looking at him and saying, I have to go, Grandpa. I have to go. And I think that service part of him, that veteran, knew that feeling that comes from inside, that you have to go and do something for the greater good that's beyond yourself. And he gave me the permission and said, you go, honey, you go, knowing what he was risking. And so I got everything together and I went back to the ambulance and we started our ride down to the city.
And so you went down that day, and did you stay for days, or like what was that like for you?
No. So again, we didn't know how long
Mhm.
we would be gone, but we got there. Getting there was very difficult, as you could imagine. There were a lot of bomb threats on the bridges and different roadways. So it took a long time for us to navigate and get down there. We had escorts. We had radio transmissions that would reroute us if something was happening on the particular roadway. We were initially supposed to go to the Meadowlands in New Jersey, and it was going to be a massive staging area where they would bring victims to care for them. And then we got rerouted to Chelsea Piers ultimately in the end. And when we pulled up to Chelsea Piers, there were hundreds of ambulances lined up in front of Chelsea Piers. And when they took us inside, they had dozens, maybe hundreds of mobile surgery units set up with teams ready to receive victims and ready to give medical care. And so they oriented us, and we had our area. We did help quite a bit flushing eyes out and those kinds of smoke inhalation or ash injuries. But there came a time, I would say, in the wee hours, when one of the people I look up to the most and who I learned a lot from at the time, I remember her saying, "Bonnie, we have to go. It's time to go." And I looked at her because I was 19, and I said, "But I don't want to go. There's more to be done." And she looked at me and said, "We have to go back, and other people's turns have to come." And the other fact of the matter was that we were expecting hundreds, thousands of people to come for medical aid. And somewhere in that time frame, I would say it hit me that they're not coming. No one's coming. So I think the gravity of realizing that at that age, and also being told it was time to leave, we were leaving because we weren't needed anymore. There were other people that were going to take our place. So that helpless feeling of leaving and feeling like you couldn't do very much. Yes, we did the roles we were asked to do at that time. And we helped a few people for sure, but I felt so helpless. I remember feeling that I was abandoning everybody.
Yeah. I can't imagine. So you guys stayed at that unit, right? So you never went to the pile itself.
We did not. No. And I would never want to misrepresent anything that I'm saying or to make it sound that I had done something more than what I had done. So what we did was staging at Chelsea Piers. So when I talk to other first responders, either colleagues or people that I treat, I'm very careful because I don't know what it was like to be at ground zero working there and rescuing and being there for hours and days on end, passing buckets. I don't know what that is like firsthand. So some of the things that have been shared with me professionally over the years or that I've read are things that I can certainly understand a slice of, but I would never be able to understand what it was to be there looking for my own friends, my own colleagues, family.
Yeah.
I can only share my sliver of it.
I'm curious. Obviously, we'll get into your work now, but looking back on it today, how do you feel like that day shaped you and what you do now and who you are?
I think it changed everything for me. And I don't think I realized at the time, as one can't when you're young and you don't know what your life story will unfold to be. But at that time, I didn't realize the impact that it had on me and what I would be doing in the future. So in college, I remember I was a psychology undergraduate, and I was still doing EMS, which I absolutely adored and loved when I started doing that. And I would say 9/11 put me in a place of being more in a leadership role as the years would go on, because at a young age I learned what it was to be in a mass casualty incident, and I really understood the moving parts of that in EMS wise. But then all the while I was in college for my psychology degree, and I do remember doing a paper that was called The Psychology of Emergency Medicine. I started to get very, very curious at that time of how do first responders deal with what they see? How do they live through these events? And truthfully, I did not have PTSI from 9/11. I didn't have nightmares. I didn't have any of the symptoms that we will see when someone is impacted by trauma. I certainly had grieving points with it, but that's the other thing I'm very careful about saying is that I can't say that I had a trauma response or needed treatment from it. So I went on and I got my psychology degree. Then I went on to get my master's in social work, and I really didn't think about first responders and mental health for a very long time until I went to work in Sandy Hook after the shootings. So 3 days after, I called and I said, I really want to come up and do some crisis counseling. And so I did at a local agency. And I ended up staying for 4.5 years because I quickly realized and understood that the work that had to be done was long term, and that I didn't want to go in, be there for a few days, and leave. I didn't want to abandon the needs of the community at that time. And so I stayed. And in staying, I ended up working with first responders who had been through Sandy Hook. So here we are. I hadn't thought about treating first responders in years. Fast forward, now I'm a licensed clinical social worker, and I start working with first responders. And I would say it all came together for me and clicked. And somewhere in that time, I realized this is my niche, this is my calling. This is what my higher power wants me to do, is to help my brothers and sisters in the first responder world, to help them, because I understand what it is to be on calls. Again, I did not understand what it was to be in a Sandy Hook kind of event as an EMT, but I was bringing experience as an EMT to the therapy and working with the first responders.
That's so powerful, and also such a full circle moment.
Yeah,
And
yeah,
obviously they're different events, but I'm sure you saw similarities between treating 9/11 first responders and Sandy Hook. I'd love to hear, obviously, on a general level, what you found.
yes. Well, so there are a lot of similarities, as you could imagine. So even though the situations are very different and so many nuances, a lot of the feelings and symptoms end up being the same, right? So feeling hopeless or helpless, like I couldn't do anything, I couldn't save people. That is a very common theme that comes up with both. The loss of life as one knew it. You know, anyone who has lived through these disasters, I've learned over the years, they kind of categorize their life before the event and after the event, because so many things change, not just the frame of reference in one's life, but the actual environment. So I would say that hopeless and helpless is pretty unique to first responder culture, in that you're sent to do a job, and whenever you cannot do that job or the process is thwarted, it's really, really difficult for first responders. And that's often where we see post traumatic stress injury or acute stress disorder set in, is because of that feeling of not being able to do what you are trained to do.
Yeah, that makes sense. And it's interesting. I've spoken to so many different responders in the past 2 years doing this project. And I feel like there's some of them who go to therapy or have gone to therapy and it's helped them immensely. And then there are others who have gone to therapy, but they don't like bringing it up anymore because it makes them actually their symptoms worse. I'm curious to kind of your perspective of those two
Right.
scenarios.
Well, so sadly, to this day in our private practices, especially because of the proximity myself and colleagues have in Fairfield County, we will still get people coming in to this day who have never had therapy
Oh,
for 9/11, and they're coming to us for the first time, or Sandy Hook. So not everyone also gets help right away. You know, it depends where you go and how open you are to receiving help. Sometimes first responders go to get help and they don't have a good experience, or the therapist doesn't understand their culture, doesn't understand the kinds of tasks that they're faced with when they're in these situations. And so that can also be a barrier. But I do a particular type of therapy called EMDR therapy, eye movement desensitization reprocessing, and it is life changing, and it treats the root of the trauma and these feelings that I'm talking about, kind of the negative beliefs that one forms of themselves after events. And it really, really treats the root of the issue. So there is talk therapy involved in it, but the reason it works so well with first responder culture is because we're getting to the actual crux of why this is haunting someone. And sometimes it's because that event was the straw that broke the camel's back. And now we have childhood traumas that are flooding back. You know, maybe someone lived through things as a child or teenager that they felt helpless over or hopeless in. And so now they're in another situation that mimics those same feelings. And now we see that cascade effect.
that's amazing. And something fascinating to me about EMDR is the science behind it. The whole idea of you replicating REM sleep with the eye movements, and then that's where you
Yes.
process life. So you're reprocessing life events, which is so cool.
I mean, I love it. I can't say enough about it. I could talk about it all day, every day. And the first responders, especially that come in to get that kind of treatment, once they start doing EMDR, they realize how effective it
Yeah.
is. So yes, people are avoidant of talking about the trauma or the symptoms because it kicks it all up
Mhm.
and it stirs it up. And when you're not working on those roots, I think talking about it can make it worse. It can bring it to the surface and you can have increased nightmares and things like that. But if you're bringing it up to do a therapy like EMDR, or there are other modalities too, like trauma focused CBT and some other methods that are out there that help people. But I find that if you're bringing up those things in order to do the work, you're going to go in the right direction. So things sometimes get a little worse before we can get them better. But I have a confidence with EMDR when people come into the office that I can draw from my own experience or the experience with others.
Yeah, and I'm curious, we talked about the similarities between 9/11 first responders and other events, but was there anything unique you found with this specific event?
I think many things are unique, and I could probably talk for a long time, but one of the most striking is the amount of brothers and sisters in the first responder world that were killed.
Hmm.
It is rare for first responders to go to calls where a lot of their own have passed or been killed. And that added another complex layer, so if people were in the city and people from their own house had died, or cousins, brothers, sisters, people they had been trained by, I think that it, in some cases, made the helpless feeling worse. And just there's something knowing that police, fire, EMS ran into those buildings to help people and they died. They died doing their job and doing something they love and that they were passionate about, and they risked it all to save people.
Yeah.
So I think that's something that can resonate, I think, with any human being, but especially as another first responder, you go into situations where you know that that could happen to you, that you could lose your life. But to know that so many did, I think, impacted all first responders and added another layer.
Yeah, absolutely. I was speaking to I think FDNY firefighter Mike Connolly, and he was talking about how he was in Long Island at the time that the
Mm.
towers got hit, but a lot of his brothers and sisters from the department went in, and like looking at those towers and going in like that's such a powerful moment, because if you looked at that tower, the
Yeah,
likelihood of you coming out is probably very slim.
yeah.
So I can't imagine those who are still alive and knowing people who did that, what that's
Yeah.
like.
No, and I often in these kinds of conversations, I'll put myself in someone's shoes for a moment. And I can't fathom. I can't fathom what it would have been like to do what they did and to decide what they did. And it's training and it's your heart and your soul. And you just know you have to go in and save as many people as possible. That feeling is something that I understand,
Hmm.
but I can't fully understand what they would have felt standing there.
And given kind of the tight knit community that the first responders have for 9/11 specifically, have you found, like, what role do you think family and community has with the recovery and the healing from that event had?
Well, I think, first of all, to understand that these events impact one's family,
Yeah.
whether you're a responder or a survivor, everything that you're experiencing inside of your brain is going to be brought home to your family, and it impacts your spouse, your children. So I think a lot of education has to be done with families and a lot of support provided in understanding what your loved one is going through, especially if they've responded to one of these scenes. What was it like? And it's hard for people that aren't in the first responder professions to understand some of the choices or some of the feelings that are there. So I find that psychoeducation is very helpful in letting families understand what your first responder is going through. community and family can be incredibly supportive, incredibly, in lifting that person up, providing support, providing space at times when it's needed. But I can't say enough about family therapy. Sometimes getting kids into therapy as well is helpful. Everyone is going to have their own impact. And so it helps to go through it and process. But there's been so much healing and so much good that comes out of these situations that I feel I've bared witness to that with 9/11, but also through Sandy Hook, bearing witness to a lot of good comes from humanity. Nonprofits, agencies, walks, runs. Look at the Stephen Siller Foundation, the Tunnel to Towers run. What they do is absolutely incredible. And a lot of people who've gone through that experience say how powerful and healing it's been for them. So whereas there's so much darkness and so much difficulty that we have to look at, there is also post-traumatic growth and beauty that can come from these situations, and people getting more help and building cohesiveness as groups and community.
Yeah, I mean, if you just even at a high level of, there was 9/11 and the day after, how we came together
Yeah,
so beautifully. Like, that's
yeah,
unfortunate that like that event needs to happen, that magnitude needs to happen for us to come together
right.
like that. But yeah, there's I agree, there's so much beauty. And I know you can't really get into details
Mhm.
of your clients, but I'm curious, are there any examples of significant progress or breakthroughs that you could share at a very general level?
Yes, and some of the people that I've treated with 9/11 again have had similar feelings of helplessness. And there's nothing more amazing than sitting with someone when they're doing EMDR and they're talking about, being in the pile or at ground zero in that area, and they have an epiphany moment, realizing that they did everything they could. And even if they didn't do what they had set out to do or that they wanted to do, sitting with someone when they start crying because they understand they did everything they could is one of the most beautiful things I feel that I have the blessing really to bear witness to at times. And yes, I'm very protective of my clients and their confidentiality, of course, but I think those beautiful moments have to be shared because those moments are attainable. And I think for anybody listening, I would want them to know that therapy can help you get to a place of really understanding and not having to beat yourself up and feel that survivor's guilt that people walk around feeling.
And I'm curious, after they have that breakthrough, like, how do they feel? Like, do they feel lighter? Like, is it just
Yes.
like they see it in their everyday moving forward?
Yes. They feel like a weight has been lifted from their back. And in the days after, they start to feel life is a little bit easier. And maybe their lens is shifted. Everything's not dark. They kind of are looking at the world in a new pair of glasses.
That's
And
so beautiful.
yeah. And, through EMDR, there's a lot of imagery. And
Hmm.
I don't think we really talk about that part enough. But I'm always amazed when we're doing EMDR, the amount of imagery that's coming up in a session. And sometimes people will actually feel a weight being lifted. Physiologically, they feel something lifting from them and leaving their body.
Yeah.
Um, and I think that part of EMDR, the spiritual, the kind of voodoo sounding part, is a little bit scary for people.
Right.
Um, but it's incredible when someone can say, I feel lighter. I'm not carrying this on my chest or in my stomach or on my back the way that I was. And obviously, that's always my goal. I consider myself a first responder to first responders. So I want to get in there and fix them and get them feeling better and giving them a better life again.
And for you, like, I'm always so like inspired by what you do, but I think I would probably start crying in the session if I, saw something like this. So for you, is it like emotional? Do you like have to like make yourself not cry?
So, look, I have one thing on my side, which is that I'm also a first responder,
Right.
right? So they all know that when they come here. They already understand that about me. I'm an empath. I have a lot of empathy, a lot of compassion for people. So when I'm sitting with somebody, I'm really 100% focused on where they are and how they're feeling, to the point where sometimes I can feel a slice of their emotions inside of me.
Mm-hmm.
I have good boundaries. I learned how not to take these situations home. I had to learn in Sandy Hook. I could not take that home or it would have destroyed me. So I do have good boundaries, but absolutely there are moments where I'll get teary eyed, or if my client has an epiphany and they're getting teary eyed, sometimes I get teary eyed with them, just knowing how much better they feel, or that this was a moment that's going to change their life. Um, and I think that in that moment, they appreciate that I'm right there holding it with them, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
So there's never a, oh my gosh, I can't believe you're welling up a little, but there are times where I absolutely do.
Well, yeah, I mean, you're human.
I'm
You're not like
human.
a robot. So that,
Yes.
that
Yeah. Yeah.
makes sense. Yeah. And I'm curious, like, how has working with first responders, we've kind of touched on it, but like, has it changed your professional identity? Is it like
Yes.
now, yeah, like I'm curious to how it evolved as you worked with them.
Yeah. So when I moved on from Sandy Hook, I decided that it was time for me to move forward, and I wanted to start a private practice. And one of the first things I did was I had been sort of fantasizing about this for years, about setting up a support group for first responders where police, fire, EMS, dispatch could all come together and just talk about shared experiences and feelings. It had always been a fantasy of mine. And when I started my practice, I said, you know what? I'm doing it. It's time. I just felt that it was time. And it took a long time, for it to grow and grow and grow. And I approached my colleague who had been working with first responders as well, and I asked her to join me. And we've been doing the group probably 6 years. We love it. We've helped a lot of people. We get people from all over the country, but it's great because instead of living in your little silo of EMS or police, you're coming together with other first responders who understand not only the subject matter of calls and what it is to respond, but they talk about their personal lives as well. So I would say that group, and just going into it knowing I want to treat first responders. And also somewhere along the way, another colleague approached myself and the same colleague, Stacy Raymond, who does the group with me, and he asked us to do a podcast. It's called Responder Resilience,
It's amazing.
and we love it. The amount of people that we've met just nationally, even some internationally, connecting with all of our brothers and sisters across the branches. It's been an incredible journey. And I also want to say that I joined a local team called the Fairfield County Trauma Response Team when I worked in Sandy Hook. And this group of people treats first responders. It's a specific team for first responders. So fast forward, I'm now one of the clinical directors. So everything just fell right into place for me to do this work. And the infrastructure that I have with the team and the group, it was just meant to be. That's the only way that I can describe it to you. And I see probably about 70% first responders now, 30% civilians. The
Wow.
civilians I see tend to have pretty severe traumas. They've lost children, they've lost a loved one to suicide, they've been in a bad accident. But I'm so passionate about the first responder stuff. So everything did come full circle for me. Surprisingly, I didn't plan it that way, but I think there were other plans laid out for me.
That's amazing. And for your podcast, the first responders, is it in all different scenarios, or do you focus on specific events within the podcast itself?
So we focus on responder mental health and wellness.
Okay.
So anything relating to PTSI or all of the supplemental therapies that could help someone. We talk a lot about just trends in the field or what we're seeing in our offices. So institutional abandonment is one that comes up a lot, or betrayal trauma from work, when people feel like their superiors don't have their back or they're not being checked on after some of these events. So we
Right.
talk about calls themselves and the impacts, but we also talk about What are people seeing across the branches, and what are people coming in for in terms of their trauma work?
Wow, that's so helpful. I'll definitely link it in the description to this so that
Great.
people can go to it because I think that's so needed and amazing that you're doing that.
Thank you. We love it. It's so fun. I love meeting new people. I learn something from every single guest that we interview. So I don't think that you could ever stop learning in any job, but especially in this one, I feel so stimulated. And I also feel I don't know everything, but I want to. So I want to
Right.
keep doing it. Keeps me so passionate because I know there are more things that I want to know that someone's going to tell me.
Yeah. And I'm curious in your opinion, being in this work for so long, what policies or support services do you think are lacking or needed right now to support responders?
So many.
Mhm.
Responders are in crisis. The suicide rates have surpassed the line of duty death rates.
Wow.
Most people don't know that unless you do this kind of work. It's not okay. People need help. Responders are tasked with a job that is seeing the abnormal every single day, and it becomes their normal. I think police see something like 400 to 600 critical incidents in a career. Your
Whoa.
average person, it's maybe two or three. So we have to be doing more. We need lawmakers to understand what first responders are doing. They're not being paid enough as well. They're paid and they're volunteer first responders, but the people that do it for a paid living, they're not being paid enough. A lot of them work two or three jobs, or they work 90 hours a week. Um, there's some really good bodies of work that have come out in the last few years. One of them is called EMS in Crisis by Bryony Gilby. It's a documentary, and she really looks at the crisis in EMS right now with staffing shortages, the amount of hours, the unequal pay. We need to go a long way to help first responders. They need peer support teams. I think ideally we would have embedded clinicians, people like myself and my colleagues in the departments sitting there so that when they come back from these calls, we can do a debriefing.
I'm surprised they don't have that. Or I was just gonna ask, like,
Yeah,
I'm sure they have health insurance, but it should probably be very more easily accessible to have therapy and stuff for them. But
right.
do they not have that as of now?
So it's sort of different everywhere. Some departments are super progressive, have really high functioning, great peer support teams, and have embedded clinicians in their department. But then some really don't have either.
Hmm.
A lot of places rely on EAP programs, which is great. But it's also difficult if someone, either in an EAP, or let's say you go to your local phone book and you choose Sally Therapist, on Main Street, she may not understand your culture.
Right.
First responders, it's a very unique culture. And in order to get the right mental health support, you really need people that understand that culture. So I think we need to build more cultural competence. We need more therapists who understand the culture, and just more resources, better pay. I can tell a first responder all day, oh, you need to go do yoga, you need to work out. But if this person needs to work three jobs to pay their bills and to keep their house, realistically, they can't do the wellness activities that I'm asking them to do.
Right.
So we really need to shine a light on this population, and we all need to do more. It is not okay that more are dying by their own hands than by the hazards of the job.
Yeah, that's insane. Yeah, oh my God. I was going to ask another question just based on your experience, which is, I mean, obviously, like, you must have a lot of insight on how to approach these situations, but if someone is interested in going into this work, what advice would you give them?
I would say get trained, connect with other therapists who understand the population, who can bring you along, who can give you advice, give you pointers. Call your local fire department and see if they offer ride-alongs, or go and bring donuts and coffee and ask if you can go inside and see. And there are so many different ways to get connected, but with this particular culture, they have to know you're genuine and that you care.
Hmm.
So if you're a therapist who's showing up, just to get paid, it's not going to work. They
Right.
have to understand why and that you're invested in their culture, and that you're all in. You can't be willy nilly with first responders.
Right.
You have to be able to sit with them and hear everything they have to put out on the table. They can't be worried about us. They have to be able to get all those things out and know that the person listening can handle it, understands it, and knows what kind of direction to go in, and knows what's normal for their culture, right? So
Right.
the gallus humor that first responders use, some civilians are really deeply offended by that, or would not know what to make of it. But for first responders, that's how they cope, is to be able to have a little bit of humor here and there. So I think even for therapists working with first responders to understand that and to be able to roll with that, even if you're not making the jokes yourself, rolling with it and understanding that it's really a part of the culture, and it's
Is it
helpful.
also like a coping mechanism too, right?
Yes.
Like you got to have some
Yes.
levity to be able to get through
Yes.
it.
Well, yeah, and you can't just wade and wade and wade in darkness, deepness, without kind of pulling yourself out of it here and there. So
Right.
I find that the opposite extreme is that humor, right? And
Yeah.
that's when some of the jokes will come. And we even see it in the group that we run. If we're in a deep topic for a long time, someone will all of a sudden just drop this funny little grenade in there, and everybody laughs, and it lightens the mood, and
Yeah.
it's like a pendulum swinging. The pendulum had to go the other way to pull us out of that.
Yeah. It's so interesting.
It is.
I have a section at the end of this where I ask some lighter questions, but was there
Sure.
anything you wanted to chat about before we went into this kind of more light round of questions?
I wanted to thank you for inviting me on, because as I was thinking about preparing, I realized I had so many thoughts that I wanted to share. Um, and even just getting the message out that first responders need help, that's number one for me. So if someone listening to this, if that sparks a light bulb in them to get help or to help someone, or if they know a local lawmaker they can talk to about policy, that's why I do these kinds of things.
Well, thank you for coming on. This has
You're
been such
welcome.
an insightful episode. I'm super excited to share it with everyone because I think anyone who listens will take something good from it.
Thank you.
Okay, so we have 3 questions left. And the first one is, what's the most beautiful thing you've learned doing this work?
That people can heal, that you can take your past. I've learned it myself too through EMDR, that you can take disturbing things that have happened to you, around you, and you can work on them and put them behind you, and you can be happy and find the other side of all of it.
That is really beautiful. What is giving you the most energy right now?
The first responders, truthfully,
Hmm.
um, working with them keeps me high paced, keeps me on my toes. Um, there's always something new to learn, or a new term that they're using, and just their motivation, and their courage when they make that step over your doorstep. That just drives me forward.
They also, from my experience, are some of the funniest people I've ever met. They're both like the most inspiring, but also hilarious people.
Yes. The other thing I'll say is incredibly loyal.
Yes.
Um, to this day, some of the people that I made friends with when I was 17 are still my closest friends in my entire life. The way that we understand each other, the way that we bond over life and death, it takes all of the superficiality out of everything. And it's to the point where I can call my old partner and say his name on the phone, and he knows something's not okay with me.
Wow.
The way that you read each other and you bond on this deep soul level, that's very, very hard to replicate in the civilian world. I'm not going to say it's impossible, because for myself, I do have friends that are civilians that I feel that same way. But the loyalty that you have with your brothers and sisters is incredible. And I think part of that too is what leads a lot of us into this work is childhood trauma or lack of family. I told you I grew up with my grandparents, and when I joined EMS, it was like this beautiful family that I had always wanted.
Mm-hmm.
And yes, nobody's perfect, no family's perfect, but it was everything I wanted. And so for me to gain like these brothers and sisters or these mother figures, there were a lot of women that really served as mother figures to me back then and helped kind of raise me. And to this day, yeah, they're still moms to me.
That's one of the most common things I hear when I'm talking to people who are involved in so many different ways, whether it be going down to DC to
Right.
fight for the bills being passed or what have you. But they say, I have a family I wouldn't have had if I didn't do this work. And
Yes.
I think that's kind of the biggest common thread I've seen from the conversations, which is
Yeah.
so beautiful.
Yeah. And a lot of us needed it or need it. And so it's a beautiful world. First responder world. Yes, we have a lot of challenges and traumas, but it changed my life. And I would not be who I am today without EMS. I wouldn't be the therapist that I am without it. Um, so I'm grateful that I got to marry my two worlds, like EMS and therapy. And I think that the passion that I have inside, it comes from knowing that I'm doing what I'm meant to do, truthfully.
That's amazing. And sounds just very fulfilling for you and
Yes.
in so many ways, which
Yeah.
is something that not a lot of people can say, which
Yeah.
is beautiful. And the last question is, what's something exciting you have planned for this year?
We have a couple of different proposals in to a couple of conferences. So we're hoping to hear back from one of them, which would put myself and my colleague presenting to EMS and fire. So we're really hoping that that comes to fruition. Um, that would be really, really exciting. And it
That,
would touch a lot of people and get a lot more people help, which is what drives all of this.
that's amazing. And if I can help in any way, obviously I'm here. Thank you
Thank
so
you.
much for coming on this. This is such an amazing episode. And
You're welcome.
yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much for asking me, and thank you for the work that you're doing because they need you. And these disasters are not over for a lot of people. The general population moves forward with life, but remember how many people are still stuck and need help.